She had just moved to Texas, starting a new chapter, not just in geography but in her spirit. Sandra had dreams, sharp opinions, and a backbone that came from years of surviving with grace. She wasn't loud, but she was clear. She wasn't rebellious, but she was bold. And she wasn't threatening, but she was black, and in America that meant something different. It was a sunny Friday when she got in her car. Her music was on low, the kind of rhythm you hum to without noticing. She was thinking about job interviews, friends, life, not revolution. She signaled left. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe she hesitated. Maybe she moved too slowly. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she was just human. A police cruiser pulled behind her. Flashing lights. That mechanical chirp that tightens every black driver's throat, no matter how innocent the ride. She pulled over, calm, alert. She knew the drill. The officer approached. He said she failed to signal a lane change. She didn't argue. But he asked her to put out her cigarette. She asked if she had to, and that was enough. The tone shifted. What should have been a warning, or a ticket, escalated. Words flew. Tone hardened, doors flung open. Her voice rose, his temper followed. He pulled her from the car, slammed her down, arrested her. 3 days later, she was dead in a jail cell. The official report said suicide, but her family, and the world, said no, because Sandra Bland was not the kind of woman who just gave up. She was sharp, opinionated. She spoke on social justice. She filmed herself unpacking racism. She dreamed of mentoring young black girls. Her voice was clear, full of life. So how did she vanish so easily? That question lit a fire, because Sandra wasn't a symbol, not at first. She was a sister, a daughter, a friend, a woman trying to get to her next job interview. She didn't set out to change the world, but her death, in silence, behind closed doors, with no footage showing what happened in that cell, became the tremor before an earthquake. People began asking deeper questions. Why are minor infractions escalating into arrests? Why do our jail systems disappear people instead of protecting them? Why is a traffic stop a death sentence for some and a slap on the wrist for others? And behind every policy debate, every legal brief, there was this deeper ache. How do we live in a world where being yourself and where being human can make you a target? Sandra's case pulled the curtain back, not just on systemic racism, but on silence, on how easy it is to disappear someone once they're behind bars, on how stories can be twisted when the victim can no longer speak, on how the truth gets edited, buried, lost. But the nation didn't let it go. People marched. Her name trended. Hashtags formed. Mothers cried. Fathers gave interviews with trembling lips. Her face was printed on signs. Her story became curriculum. Her death forced conversations no one wanted to have. Yet beneath the protests there was another, quieter wave, a wave of introspection. People began reflecting, not just on Sandra, but on themselves. Am I listening to the voices of the unheard? Do I get uncomfortable and shut down the moment the topic gets too raw? Have I ignored the pain of others because it didn't directly affect me? It's easy to read headlines and scroll on, but Sandra wasn't a headline. She was breath and skin and memory. She had laugh lines and favorite songs. She had dreams she hadn't yet chased. Her toothbrush still sat on the counter in that new apartment. Her phone still had saved texts from friends checking in. She was real. And that realness, that everyday humanness, is what makes her story unforgettable. Because every one of us has moments when we're misunderstood, when we're dismissed. When our emotions are labeled aggressive, our boundaries are called attitude, our courage is mistaken for combativeness. But Sandra's story teaches something deeper. You don't have to be perfect to deserve dignity. You don't have to be passive to deserve peace. You don't have to be silent to deserve safety. You just have to be. Her story also holds a mirror up to authority, to what happens when power goes unchecked, when fear overrides facts, when procedures replace humanity. But perhaps even more powerfully, it speaks to how we respond. Do we let stories like Sandra's fade, tucked away with the rest of the news cycle? Or do we carry them with us, letting them shape how we show up in our own lives. Do we raise our voices when someone gets dismissed in a meeting? Do we slow down and actually hear people when they speak of their pain? Do we question the systems we've come to accept as just how things are? Sandra's life reminds us, comfort is the enemy of change. Change doesn't come in silence, it doesn't come in politeness. It comes when people rise again and again and say, not this time. And you don't have to be in the streets to make a difference. You can mentor, you can teach, you can listen, you can refuse to laugh at that joke, you can correct your child when they repeat something they don't yet understand. You can hold space, you can ask questions, you can grow. That's what Sandra would have done. That's what she was doing. She wasn't famous, but she was impactful. She didn't plan a movement, but she inspired one. And now it's up to us, not to imitate her, but to honor her, to live in ways that make stories like hers impossible, to build systems that are transparent, accountable, and just, to be the kind of people who refuse to look away. So the next time you hear someone say, "It was just a traffic stop," ask yourself, is it ever just that, or is it the beginning of a story we can't afford to ignore? Sandra didn't get to finish her story, but you are still writing yours, and the question is, what kind of world will you help create with it? The days after Sandra's death were heavy, not just for her family, but for every person who had ever been told to calm down when they were simply speaking up, for every woman who had been labeled difficult for standing her ground, for every black person who had been stopped, questioned, or cornered, not because they did something wrong, but because someone decided they looked wrong. People across the country began to see something in Sandra's story that mirrored their own lives. Some remembered being pulled over with no explanation. Others recalled how their loved ones were treated unfairly, not because of their behavior, but because of how they looked. And that sparked something deeper, not outrage for outrage's sake, but reflection. In the quiet moments between the headlines, people began to wonder how many other Sandras there were. Stories not recorded, names not trending, lives cut short without the world ever knowing. Parents began having different kinds of conversations with their children, no longer just about being careful, but about being aware, about knowing their rights, about staying alive in a world where injustice often wears a badge. Some people questioned the systems they once trusted. Others realized how much they had overlooked, not out of cruelty, but out of comfort. And that's what made Sandra's story so powerful. It didn't just spark protests, it awakened conscience. It forced people to think not only about the event, but the environment, the culture that made it possible. The history behind the silence, the structure behind the sorrow, and in the center of it all was a woman, a real person. Not a hashtag, not a martyr, a woman who had plans, who had purpose, who was known by friends as funny, kind, honest, and unapologetically herself. In one of her videos, Sandra had said, "It's time, y'all, it's time to stop being silent." She had no idea how prophetic her words would be, but silence did not follow her death. Voices rose, college students organized forums, pastors gave sermons, activists held town halls. Her story was discussed in courtrooms, classrooms, and homes. It crossed state lines, racial lines, and political lines. People who had never thought deeply about policing began to ask new questions. People who had once dismissed the term systemic racism began to research. And for the first time, many began to listen, not to defend, not to argue, but to understand. Sandra became a symbol, not because she asked to be, but because her story revealed something no one could unsee. And her legacy, it lives in every honest conversation that followed. It lives in the reforms that were proposed, in the policies being challenged, in the small acts of courage, someone pulling out their phone during a traffic stop, someone checking on a friend after they've been released, someone using their platform to tell hard truths. Sandra's death was a tragedy, but her life was a lesson. And that lesson, if we truly sit with it, is about more than justice. It's about humanity. It's about seeing people fully, listening closely, acting boldly. It's about learning to pause before judging, to ask questions before assuming, to defend the dignity of those who can no longer speak. Because in a world racing toward convenience and control, it's easy to lose the art of empathy. But empathy is what builds bridges. Empathy is what saves lives. And Sandra's story, raw, heartbreaking, unfinished, reminds us of that truth. She wasn't just a name on a file. She was a voice that still echoes, a light that was dimmed but not extinguished. And every time we choose to lead with compassion, to stand for truth, to fight for fairness, her light returns. So ask yourself in your daily life, your job, your home, your relationships, how do you respond when someone's voice is dismissed? What do you do when silence is easier than speaking up? How often do you examine your own assumptions, your own reactions, your own place in a world shaped by history? These questions are not comfortable, but growth never is. Change doesn't come from scrolling. It comes from showing up, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when it's unpopular, especially when the cost is high. Sandra paid a price. She should never have had to. And now we honor her not by weeping, but by waking up, by refusing to let her story be just another statistic, by deciding that in our own lives we will do better, that we will see more, speak more, stand more. Because her life mattered, her truth mattered, and if we truly listen, not just to her story, but to the story of every person pushed to the margins, then maybe, just maybe, we'll start building a world where no one has to die for simply living. And still, the question lingers, not just what happened, but why it keeps happening. What happens when a nation sees a face like Sandra's and labels it aggressive before it ever learns her name? What does it say about a culture when confidence in a black woman is seen as defiance, when her calm resistance is viewed as a threat? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones, because behind every viral clip, every tragic headline, every trending hashtag, there is always a human being, someone who had morning routines, favorite songs, inside jokes, birthday memories, someone who laughed, who cried, who mattered. And when we reduce people to the worst moments of their lives, or worse, to someone else's worst assumptions, we lose something bigger than justice. We lose our soul. Sandra Bland was not a perfect person. None of us are. But perfection should never be the price for being treated with dignity. Respect isn't something to be earned through compliance. It's a basic right. And as her mother said in one of the many interviews afterward, "My daughter deserved to make it home." That sentence echoes in the hearts of parents across America, because it's not just about traffic stops, it's about trust. It's about whether the systems built to protect are doing their job for everyone, or just for some. In the weeks following her death, a groundswell of advocacy formed. Not a one-time protest, but a movement. People began pushing for things like better mental health checks in jails, for officers to wear body cameras, not just for accountability, but for clarity, for transparency in investigations that too often were sealed behind bureaucracy and silence. Some of those efforts found resistance, some found progress, but all of them found purpose. Because once your eyes are opened, you can't go back. You can't unsee injustice. You can't unhear a mother's cry. You can't unknow the pain of watching someone be swallowed by a system that never saw their full humanity. And maybe that's the gift. Painful as it is, because sometimes the deepest growth comes from the deepest grief. For many who heard Sandra's story, it became a mirror. They looked inward. They questioned old beliefs. They changed how they taught their children. They spoke up in meetings. They stopped laughing at racist jokes. They interrupted bias. They didn't wait for a headline to act. They made justice part of their daily choices. Because change isn't just about marching. It's about mentoring. It's not just protest signs. It's personal discipline. It's holding institutions accountable and holding ourselves accountable. And maybe in the quiet moments, Sandra would have smiled knowing that she had become a teacher in the truest sense, her life reminding people that strength doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth when it's inconvenient. Sometimes it's choosing patience in a world trained to provoke. Sometimes it's being kind when no one else is watching. And sometimes it's knowing your worth, even when the world refuses to see it. That was Sandra. And through her story we are reminded that real justice isn't just punishment, it's prevention, that real strength isn't power. It's restraint. And that real legacy isn't found in courtrooms. It's in the quiet choices we make to become better, bolder, more aware human beings. So today, wherever you are, whether you're a student, a worker, a parent, a neighbor, ask yourself, what kind of legacy are you building? Are you silent in the face of discomfort? Or are you willing to speak, not just for yourself, but for the Sandras of the world whose voices were cut short? Because the truth is, we don't need more martyrs. We need more listeners, more allies, more people who are brave enough to change. Not just what they believe, but how they behave. Sandra's story may have ended too soon, but its echo is still shaping hearts, still opening minds, still asking each of us, what will you do with your time? With your power? With your privilege? Will you stay safe in silence or stand up in truth? The choice is ours, and as long as her story is told, not with pity, but with purpose, then her voice will never truly be silenced. And even now, years later, that voice, Sandra's voice, continues to ripple through classrooms, courtrooms, boardrooms, and conversations around dinner tables, because she was more than a moment in history. She was a catalyst, a woman who dared to live fully, speak boldly, and confront injustice with words sharper than any weapon. She challenged the status quo, not with rage, but with reason, not with violence, but with vision. And in doing so, she left behind something that no system, no authority, no mistake can erase, a message. That message wasn't just for police departments or government officials, it was for all of us. It was for the person scrolling past the headlines, for the young girl learning to love the skin she's in, for the teacher deciding which stories to include in the lesson, for the employer choosing whom to promote, for the neighbor who notices a pattern and chooses to speak up. Because the truth is, justice isn't an abstract idea. It's not a buzzword or a checkbox. Justice is daily. It's how we treat people when no one's watching. It's the small things, like listening longer, assuming less, offering grace, and demanding better. It's not enough to say, that's just the way things are. We have to ask, why are they that way, and who benefits from keeping them that way? Sandra did, and because she asked those questions, she changed people. She changed systems. She sparked conversations that still haven't stopped. It's easy to feel helpless in a world full of injustice. Easy to think that one voice doesn't matter, but Sandra's life is proof. It does. Even when silenced, her voice moved millions, and that's the paradox of injustice. The more it tries to suppress, the louder the truth becomes. So let her story be a seed. Let it grow in your thoughts. Let it move into your actions. Start with yourself. Ask the hard questions. Am I contributing to the problem or being part of the solution? Am I silent when I should speak? Am I choosing comfort over courage? These aren't easy reflections, but they're necessary ones, because personal growth doesn't begin with applause. It begins with awareness. Awareness of bias, awareness of privilege, awareness of history, not just as a list of dates, but as living consequences that shape today and Once we become aware, we have a duty to respond, not with guilt but with growth, not with shame but with action, not just in moments of crisis, but in the mundane, in how we vote, in what we read, in who we hire, in how we raise our children. Because change isn't a one-time thing, it's a lifestyle. Sandra didn't choose to become a symbol. She wanted to live. She had dreams, plans. She wanted to start a new job, build a new life. She wanted joy, not martyrdom. But the world she lived in didn't make space for her light. It was too quick to label, too slow to listen. That's why her story still stings, why it still matters. Because it forces us to ask, how many Sandras have we already lost? And more importantly, how many more will we lose before we change? The answer to that isn't found in court rulings or hashtags. It's found in us, in what we're willing to learn, in what we're willing to unlearn, and in how we choose to carry forward the stories of those who didn't get the chance to finish theirs. Sandra Bland's story is not just a tragedy. It's a call to rise above fear, a call to reject apathy, a call to live boldly, speak truthfully, And act justly, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us something. Because real justice, real growth, doesn't come cheap. It requires humility. It demands honesty, and it begins with you. She reminds us that silence is a choice. And so is courage, because courage doesn't always look like marches or megaphones. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing to see what others ignore. Choosing to care when it would be easier. To look away. Sandra's story is a mirror. It forces us to face not only the systems outside of us, but the assumptions within us. How quickly do we judge someone based on a glance? How often do we mistake confidence for threat? How easily do we believe someone deserves less respect, less dignity, less grace? These are hard questions, but growth was never meant to be easy, and Sandra was about growth. She pushed her peers, her community, and her country to grow. To confront a truth we often hide behind policies and paperwork, that people's lives, black lives, are too often seen as expendable, explainable, or forgettable. But not this time. This time the nation saw, heard, and felt. From protests to prayers, murals to legislation, her name became more than a headline, it became a heartbeat. Because when one person suffers injustice, all of us are affected. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not with the same weight, but injustice anywhere sets a precedent. It lowers the bar. And if we're not raising it together, then we're silently agreeing to keep it low. Sandra reminds us that we all have a role in this. No one is exempt. Some will be organizers. Others will be listeners. Some will speak truth to power. Others will teach their children differently. Every act matters. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be present and persistent. That's how change happens. Not overnight, but over time. Not from one voice, but from many. From voices that refuse to be silenced. From hearts that refuse to grow cold. Sandra's heart was wide open. She believed in people, even when they disappointed her. She believed in systems, even when they failed her. She believed in growth, even when the ground was uneven. And that belief, that hope, is what lives on. In every student who refuses to shrink themselves to fit into a broken mold. In every officer who chooses compassion over control. In every leader who listens instead of lectures. In every citizen who sees the cracks in the system and chooses to fill them with action instead of apathy. Sandra taught us that real power is not in domination, but in understanding. Not in fear, but in empathy. Not in silence, but in truth. And the truth is this: her life mattered, her voice mattered, and what happened to her should never happen again. But we can't just say that, we have to build that, day by day, action by action, heart by heart. Because the question isn't whether Sandra should have survived that traffic stop. The question is, what kind of world are we building, where she didn't? If you're reading this, if you're listening to her story, then you're part of that answer. And you have a choice, to go back to comfort, or to move forward with clarity, to ignore what happened, or to let it shape who you become. Because that's what her story really is. Not just a warning, but a way forward, a way to become more awake. More aware, more alive, to live with purpose, to act with integrity, to choose growth even when it hurts, because justice isn't just a destination, it's a direction, and Sandra is pointing us toward it. And that direction, toward justice, is not a straight path. It twists through discomfort, wins through resistance, and sometimes runs uphill against the weight of centuries. But it's the only path worth walking. And Sandra showed us that even if you're walking it alone, even if you're tired, even if your voice shakes, you still walk. Her story was not meant to end at a jail cell. It was not meant to be explained away by protocols or hidden beneath reports. It was meant to stir something, to crack open what's been sealed too long, to bring light to the places where shadows have festered, and it did. For some, it was the first time they questioned authority. For others, it was the moment they recognized their own privilege. For many, it was a rallying cry to speak louder, stand firmer, love deeper. Sandra became a symbol, not because she wanted to, but because her life echoed a truth far too familiar for far too many. The truth that sometimes doing everything right isn't enough. that sometimes your existence alone is seen as defiance, that sometimes a turn signal is all it takes for your life to be rerouted by fear, misunderstanding, and a system not built for you. But it doesn't end there, because while injustice might be loud, so is love. And the love that rose up after Sandra was not quiet. It marched in cities, it spoke in courtrooms, it lit candles, wrote laws, created scholarships, and whispered her name in the ears of the next generation. Love turned her loss into legacy, and that's the lesson that cuts through the noise. Legacy isn't built in comfort. It's built in conviction. When you decide to live fully, speak truthfully, stand bravely, and forgive, not because others deserve it, but because you deserve peace. Sandra believed in peace, but not the kind that comes from staying quiet. She believed in the peace that follows justice, the peace earned through hard conversations, accountability, and radical honesty. Her legacy asks us to reflect. Are we being honest with ourselves? Are we holding ourselves accountable? Are we listening, really listening, when someone tells us their pain? Because silence is easy, comfort is addictive, and distraction is everywhere. But growth, that's deliberate. That takes effort. That takes heart. And Sandra had heart. Enough to stand up for herself. Enough to challenge what didn't feel right. Enough to trust that even if she didn't change the world in her lifetime, she would change someone. And she did. She changed many. She changed how we see, how we speak, how we respond. So when you remember her story, don't remember the headlines. Remember the human, the laughter in her voice, the fire in her convictions, the warmth in her smile. And remember this, you are not powerless. You have influence. You have voice. You have the ability to shift something, maybe not the entire world, but a part of it. Start there. Start where you are. Because if Sandra's life taught us anything, it's that small acts of courage echo far beyond what we can see. And sometimes the most powerful revolutions begin with a simple question. What if we didn't look away? What if we didn't look away when someone is pulled over on the side of the road, clearly distressed? What if we didn't look away when a neighbor says they're afraid to walk at night in their own community? What if we didn't look away when a friend says they feel unseen, unheard, unsafe, just because of who they are? What if instead we leaned in? Not with pity, but with purpose. Not with guilt, but with growth. Because Sandra's story isn't just about injustice, it's about awakening. An awakening to the truth that systems are made of people, and people can change. Slowly, stubbornly, but surely, if we're willing to do the work. It starts with asking the hard questions, not just of the world but of ourselves. Where do I stay silent when I should speak? Where do I benefit from systems that harm others? Where am I still holding on to assumptions I need to unlearn? It's uncomfortable, but discomfort is not the enemy. Complacency is. Sandra challenged complacency. Her life, her voice, her story, these were not quiet things. They disrupted, they challenged, they made people squirm, and in that discomfort, they planted seeds, seeds of courage, seeds of accountability, seeds of love that does not flinch from truth. You see, Sandra wasn't perfect, no one is, but perfection is not a prerequisite for dignity, for compassion, for justice. She deserved to live, not just survive but live, loudly, freely, fully. And because she was denied that, we must demand it for others, not just in protest, but in policy, not just in slogans, but in systems, not just in moments of outrage, but in years of persistent, patient work, the kind of work that rebuilds broken trust, that reimagines what safety means, that teaches our children that value is not determined by zip code, hairstyle, or skin tone. It's generational work. It's sacred work, and it begins with remembering, not just the injustice, but the person. Sandra was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a dreamer, a voice, a light. She is not a footnote. She is a foundation on which we can build something better. But building requires us all, not just the outraged, not just the affected, everyone. Because the world doesn't change by accident. It changes when people choose to care more than is convenient, to act even when it's uncomfortable, to believe that tomorrow can be better, even if today still hurts. That's Sandra's legacy, that's her echo. It lives in classrooms where teachers say her name, in living rooms where families talk openly about race and justice, in courtrooms where prosecutors remember that their power is not just legal, it's moral, and in every soul who chooses presence over apathy, growth over comfort, justice over routine. So when you hear her name, don't just remember what was lost, remember what is still possible. A world where dignity is not earned by perfection, but honored by humanity. A world where the question isn't, why was she angry, but why are we not? A world where no one has to explain their existence to survive. Sandra walked toward that world. Now it's our turn to keep walking. And with each step forward, we are challenged not just to remember, but to transform pain into progress, to transform apathy into awareness, to transform outrage into organized, intentional change. Because Sandra's story didn't just end in a jail cell, it began something powerful, something lasting. A movement of hearts and minds that could no longer ignore what had always been there. And that's the true test of a legacy, what it awakens in those left behind. If you feel angry, don't silence it, channel it. If you feel sad, don't drown in it. Sit with it. Let it teach you. If you feel powerless, know this. Change has never required a crowd. It only ever starts with one. One person willing to listen deeply. One person willing to challenge their own beliefs. One person willing to stand up, not because it's easy, but because it's right. Sandra wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just living her life, with dignity, with clarity, with self-worth, and for that, she was punished. But her life reminds us that our worth is not determined by how we are treated. It is intrinsic. And no institution, no bias, no badge, no courtroom can take that away. Sandra B. lived with purpose. And her story asks us, what will your purpose be? Will you move through life on autopilot, or will you pay attention? Will you shy away from what's hard, or will you rise to meet it? Will you repeat what's comfortable, or will you reach for what's just? Because the truth is, injustice survives through repetition, through excuses, through avoidance, through the quiet whisper that says, it's not my problem. But it is. It always has been. When one person is devalued, we all are. When one voice is silenced, we all lose part of our collective truth. Sandra's voice was strong enough to be heard even now, strong enough to cut through time, through systems, through fear. And in that voice there's a message. Live boldly, stand firmly, and never apologize for taking up space in a world that's still learning how to see you. She left behind more than outrage. She left behind a map for how to speak when it's dangerous, how to smile when it's painful, how to persist when it's easier to quit. It's not a roadmap for everyone, but it's a spark, one that lights a fire in those who are ready. And if you've made it this far, you're ready. You're ready to ask more of yourself, your community, your country. You're ready to stop waiting for the perfect moment and instead become the moment. You're ready to take the baton from Sandra and say, your fight wasn't in vain. You're ready to build something better, fairer, freer, and even if the road is long, even if the path is steep, even if the voices grow loud with resistance, keep walking, keep loving, keep choosing justice, again and again and again, because when we do, Sandra walks with us, and the world she dreamed of edges a little closer to becoming real. And as we continue walking, we begin to understand that justice is not a destination, it's a daily decision. Decision to look the other way a little less, to speak the truth a little more, to hold space for those who are hurting, and to never, ever let silence become our response to injustice. Because silence is not neutral. Silence protects the comfortable. It buries pain instead of healing it. It shields systems instead of reforming them. Sandra's story reminds us that change doesn't come from silence, it comes from courage. And courage doesn't always look like protests or policy changes. Sometimes, courage is in the quiet moments, a hard conversation around the dinner table, an honest reflection in the mirror, a shift in perspective that alters everything. It's in the moments where you choose to care, deeply, inconveniently, relentlessly. Because caring is powerful. In a world that profits off our numbness, to care is to rebel, to feel is to fight, to see someone's humanity and act on it is to start a revolution. And that's the revolution Sandra deserved. Not just slogans on signs or trending hashtags, but a real reckoning with how we treat one another, especially when no one's watching. Because what happened to her wasn't just wrong, it was preventable. And if something is preventable, then we are responsible. Not just those who wear a uniform or write the laws, all of us. Because this is our society, our communities, our future. We get to shape it, and if we want that future to be one where every life is valued equally, where traffic stops don't end in tragedy, where jail cells don't become graves, then we must choose every single day to build that future together. It won't be easy, but ease was never the goal. The goal is truth. The goal is justice. The goal is a world where no family has to beg for answers, no name becomes a hashtag, and no life is lost to indifference. Sandra's story was not a mistake. It was a warning, and it's up to us to decide what we do with it. We can forget. We can scroll past. We can say, "That's terrible," and then go about our day. Or we can remember. We can reflect. We can choose to do one thing, just one thing, that brings us closer to the world she deserved to live in. And when we do that, when enough of us do that, change becomes inevitable. That's how legacies are honored, not by words, but by actions. So let your life be loud with compassion. Let your choices disrupt injustice. Let your silence break where it used to settle. And let Sandra's voice, clear, bold, unforgettable, guide you forward. She was more than a moment, she was a movement, and she still is, because movements don't die with headlines. They live in memory, they live in action, they live in every decision we make to push the world 1 inch closer to dignity, to decency, to something that resembles justice. Sandra's story reminds us that justice isn't only about laws or verdicts, it's about how we treat each other when no one's recording. It's about how we show up when there's no applause. It's about empathy, applied, not just felt. She deserved a country that didn't see her as a threat for speaking her mind, a system that didn't escalate instead of de-escalate, a response grounded in humanity, not power, not ego. And yet, despite everything, Sandra lived with strength. Even in her last days, she stood tall, through the fear, through the injustice. That kind of strength doesn't die. It passes on, quietly, powerfully, into the hands of those willing to carry it. So carry it in your conversations, in your activism, in your ability to listen to the pain of others without shrinking from the discomfort it brings. Because change begins where comfort ends. Sandra's story teaches us that standing up for truth may cost us, but silence costs more. Her death shook the nation, but it also awakened something. It sparked questions. It built bridges between strangers. It opened eyes that had been closed for far too long. And the truth is that awakening isn't finished. There's still more work to be done. More stories like Sandra's that go unheard. More systems that need to be held accountable. More hearts that need to be opened. Not with rage, but with truth. If you feel the weight of this story pressing on you, don't run from it. Lean in, let it change you. Let it make you uncomfortable. Because discomfort is the soil in which growth takes root. Ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to leave behind? What kind of legacy do you want your life to carry? And when the next Sandra finds herself in the hands of power, will the world be ready to protect her, or repeat the same cycle? You have a voice, you have a platform, you have a choice. Use it. Speak, act, learn, unlearn, grow. Because Sandra's life should not have ended behind a locked door, but her story can be the key that unlocks someone else's understanding, compassion and purpose. So don't just watch this story, live its lesson. Be the kind of person who listens deeply, who questions loudly, who refuses to accept the unacceptable, and when the world forgets, remind it. Remind it with your words. Remind it with your courage. Remind it with your example. Because change doesn't need 1 million people, it starts with one. Sandra was one. Now, maybe it's your turn. Because movements only live when we breathe life into them, every day in quiet decisions and bold actions alike. It starts when a teacher reshapes her lesson plan to include voices like Sandra's, when a teenager refuses to laugh at a racist joke, when a police officer chooses de-escalation over dominance, when a prosecutor looks at a case and sees a human being, not a headline, when a judge remembers that justice isn't only law, it's morality in motion. It starts with the moments no one sees, the moments when we choose integrity over ease, accountability over silence, justice over justification. Sandra wasn't a martyr by choice. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a voice that rang out with truth. And when she was taken, something in all of us should have stirred. Because if a routine traffic stop can end in tragedy, then no one is truly safe from the consequences of unchecked power. That's the world we're living in, but it doesn't have to be the world we leave behind. The path forward is uncomfortable. It always has been. It demands more than outrage. It demands responsibility. To learn, to vote, to organize, to ask hard questions and listen to harder answers. To challenge the narratives that keep systems in place. To dismantle the illusion that silence equals peace. To believe, fiercely and unapologetically, that every human life carries equal weight. Sandra carried that belief with her, and for a time the world felt it. But the news cycle moved on. The headlines faded. The system, largely unchanged, waited for the next moment to repeat itself. So here we are. Again. Another moment. Another story. Another opportunity. What will we do with it? We can turn away, scroll past, change the subject, protect our comfort, or we can stay. Stay in the discomfort. Stay in the work. Stay in the fight for a world that doesn't excuse injustice but uproots it. And we must remember, real change rarely happens in grand gestures. It happens in consistent, conscious decisions, in how we teach our children, in who we choose to believe, in what we tolerate in our communities, our politics, and ourselves. It's in refusing to be complicit, refusing to call it just the way things are. Refusing to accept fear as normal. Sandra deserved better. So do the countless others whose names we'll never hear. And so do you. So ask yourself, what kind of world would you feel proud to stand in, to raise your children in, to grow old in? Start building that world now, with your voice, with your choices, with your unwavering refusal to let another name fade into silence. Because silence is not peace, it's permission. And you were not born to be passive. You were born to be powerful. Sandra's light still shines, let it guide you. So when the moment comes, when you hear that voice inside whisper, "This isn't right," don't ignore it. That's your compass, that's your truth. That's the echo of every story, like Sandra's asking not to be forgotten. You see, injustice doesn't begin with loud, violent acts. It starts small, in assumptions, in indifference, in letting things slide. But so does justice. It begins when you ask, why did this happen? When you stay curious, even when it's easier to walk away. When you ask others to see what they've chosen not to. When you challenge your own bias, not once, but every day. And you will feel resistance from systems, from people, even from within yourself, because change threatens comfort, and comfort clings tight. But growth comes through the friction, through the moments when your voice shakes, but you speak anyway. When your hands tremble, but you reach out anyway. When you don't know what to say, but you refuse to stay silent. Sandra's story wasn't supposed to be a movement. She wasn't trying to become a symbol. She was trying to get to work, to live her life, to be treated fairly. And when that dignity was denied her, the world had to ask itself what kind of place it had become. But the real question is, what kind of place will it become next? That answer lives in you, in us, in what we choose to see, and in how we choose to respond when we finally do. There are no heroes waiting in the wings. There's no perfect savior coming to fix it all, just people. People like you. And that's more than enough. Because one person with truth is more powerful than 100 who settle for what is. So let Sandra's story stay with you. not as a tragedy, but as a turning point. Let it remind you that your voice matters, that your silence echoes, that your presence, your awareness, can shift a culture. The world will test your conviction. It will ask you to forget, to move on, to numb out. But every time you remember Sandra, you choose to stay awake, and the world needs more people who are awake. Because being awake means you see what others pretend not to, you feel what others try to bury. You care, loudly, intentionally, and without apology. Being awake means you understand that justice isn't abstract. It's not just a courtroom word or a campaign slogan. It's a daily practice. It's how you treat the person bagging your groceries. It's how you respond when a friend says something ignorant. It's how you vote, how you show up, how you speak truth when silence would be more comfortable. Sandra's name reminds us that a system unchecked is a system unchained. It moves with no fear of consequence, no regard for the lives it crushes. But it also reminds us that when people care, deeply, collectively, things can change. Maybe not all at once, maybe not fast, but step by step, law by law, story by story. And your story, your choices, are a part of that. You don't need a platform to make a difference. You need courage, you need clarity, you need the decision made each day to stand up even when no one claps. Sandra's voice was silenced, but yours is not. So speak, not just for her, but because the world you live in is the world you help shape. Speak when it's uncomfortable. Speak when you're the only one. Speak because someone else might find the strength to speak too. And when you feel small, when you wonder if it even matters, remember this. Movements are built by individuals, not leaders, not celebrities, people. Ordinary people who dared to believe their actions weren't meaningless. Sandra believed in justice. She believed in truth. She believed in her right to exist without fear. Now, it's our turn to carry that belief forward, not in hashtags alone, not in fleeting outrage, but in sustained commitment to something better. We owe her that, we owe ourselves that. So let this be more than a story you heard. Let it be a seed. Water it with action, with attention, with intention, because the future isn't written yet.